Hi, and welcome to An Evil Mind, a crime fiction video blog from Xenobooks. I'm Nick Malowick. This week we're going to talk about the work of James Ellroy. Ellroy's born in March of 1948. His parents' tumultuous marriage, eventual divorce, split custody. One weekend when Ellroy is with his father in Hollywood, Ellroy's mother out in San Gabriel Valley in the town of El Monte is murdered. Strangled. This has, no matter what Ellroy himself says about it, probably has a very strong effect on him, and leads to somewhat to him becoming a writer. It may also figure into him becoming an alcoholic, which he did after his teen years and a brief stint in the army, so bad that he almost died from a lung abscess. He did, for a while he was in the hospital not even knowing his own name from his alcoholism and his abuse of Benzedrine asthma inhalers, which were over-the-counter items sold in the 1960s. Ellroy gets his act together, goes to AA, cleans up, caddies for years. Actually caddies up until the sale of his fifth novel. This is by his own account. But in 1980 publishes his first book, a private eye novel called Brown's Requiem. His second novel is Clandestine, which we'll come back to in a minute because there's an important historical note with that one. So, there's the biographical sketch. What I want to say about Ellroy is that you may have noticed over the course of these vlogs that most of the time I am an enthusiastic, almost... I almost said undiscerning. That's not quite true, but definitely like a booster, wildly enthusiastic. I would rather, and this goes back a million years ago. In another life, I was a book and record reviewer, and my thinking at that time was I would always rather tell people about something good rather than warn people away from something bad. Well, I'm not going to warn you away from Ellroy. He's not bad. He's a good writer, very good writer in many respects, and an impressive writer in certain ways. But my feelings about him as a writer are a lot more complicated than they are about, say, Andrew Vachss, or about Arthur Conan Doyle, as about Robert B. Parker, or Elmore Leonard. There's some things... I got a few problems, so I would not be as unreserved in my praise as I might be of some other authors. But probably my favorite book of his is White Jazz, which is the first-person account of a LAPD police lieutenant and hitman named Dave Klein. That was almost made into a movie at one point with Nick Nolte, which I would have loved to have seen that come to fruition. I don't think that's his best book. I think his best book, both in terms of writing, certainly in plotting, and Ellroy is a master plotter. You can't, and if you didn't want to say anything else nice about the guy, you could say that. The construction of these books, especially a big, sprawling book with a buttload of subplots like L.A. Confidential, the story just snaps right along, and it's a big, fat book. We'll talk about its movie in a minute. I think L.A. Confidential is his best one. One of the ones I don't particularly like is the first book in what would become known as the L.A. Quartet, Black Dahlia. So, in order of the first L.A. Quartet, because we have just begun a second L.A. Quartet. We'll get to that in a minute. Black Dahlia, The Big Nowhere, L.A. Confidential, and White Jazz. This is followed by what he calls the Underworld USA trilogy, which is American Tabloid, The Cold 6000, and Blood's a Rover. The latter two books of that trio I don't like, and I reviewed both of them, like I said, when they were in their original appearance, which was very long ago at this point. And American Tabloid, though, was actually the very first James Ellroy book, and I stumbled across it. I was a book buyer at a Tower Records, for crying out loud, And that happened to come in with some other stuff. It was released in mass market paperback, picked it up, zapped through that thing. I don't, as a book, I don't like it quite as well as I like L.A. Confidential. It's also another one very, very well plotted and assembled. And you're not going to find any cracks. You're not going to see any seams in the thing. Where I think he falls down is when he begins to abuse certain stylistic traits. And he begins these stylistic traits in L.A. Confidential when he's asked to cut the manuscript. He just starts cutting words, and his sentences get shorter and shorter. And this isn't a problem in L.A. Confidential. It's not a problem in White Jazz. Like I said, White Jazz is a first-person perspective book, told, by Dave Klein. So it's sort of, that, that's a real written as someone would talk or think, and not always in complete sentences. American Tabloid, he backs off of that. The next two books in the Underworld USA trilogy, however, and this starts in some of the short stories in books like Hollywood Nocturne or Crime Wave, those collections, where it becomes, what you would call like this rat-a-tat-tat style, where, very short sentences, incomplete sentences, everything is pop, 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 pop. That's wearing. At least for me, that's wearing, and it's one of the things that really I don't care for those books. I also don't think those books are as interesting. I want to say that there is a creative lull. There's a bit of wad shooting for a while. Along with those, there's also his memoirs. The very first one, My Dark Places, where he teams up with a former L.A. Sheriff's Department detective who did cold cases and looks into his mother's death. And there are some uncomfortable confessions from Ellroy, and I won't spoil that but I'll read that for yourself. There's another book that covers some of the same ground that comes out later that feels kind of exploitive to me. It feels like a cash grab. There really wasn't anything new about this, and wasn't anything new about his feelings for his mother. There wasn't anything new about the case. It remains unsolved to this day. But one thing that I think he kind of got lucky on, because he's writing about the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. He makes that, I think, to the 70s, but he has not really explored that decade particularly. And there was a bit of like if you're not a million years old like me, I got to tell you, in the early to mid 90s, there was a nostalgia boom for the Rat Packs, that Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, all those guys in Vegas in the 50s and 60s, swing dancing, swing music, and they're like Cherry Pop and Daddies, Brian Setzer Orchestra, Royal Crown Review, and there are also like some ska bands that started doing swing records too, and there was a big vogue for that at the time. The movie Swingers is based sort of around that Los Angeles area, world. And, Ellroy benefits from this nostalgia because he's writing about that time period. And one thing that is a little, I'm okay. It might make some people uncomfortable. One of the things Ellroy writes in his books, and his words, are about bad men doing bad things in the name of order. A lot of his protagonists are straight up bad guys. There are worse guys in his world, and those are who, his detectives, who are more or less, criminals themselves sometimes, obviously are pursuing worse criminals, like gangsters. He uses a lot of real life characters, J. Edgar Hoover, Pavsa, Mickey Cohen, Jack Dragnet, who are real Los Angeles gangsters of that era. He mentions the two Tonys, Trombino and Brancato, who are still like an unsolved gangland murder in 1950s Los Angeles. They were just found in a car, both shot in the back of the head. Although he does tie that into his fictional world. William Parker, who was the chief of police, in Los Angeles in the 1940s, rather not the 40s, but 50s and 60s. You know, all of these people become real characters. And at times, I think there's a tone of nostalgia. It's there if you want it. You know, there's nostalgia for that era, for that you know, that particular style of brutal law enforcement. You know, of crooked law enforcement that may still do some good incidentally, you know, in the course of its criminality. Um, and I think, you know, Ellroy presents that. He doesn't necessarily present it as a good thing. Ellroy's politics are frankly unknown. His public persona is so performative. You don't really know where he is. He says, for example, he claims at one point to have been, voted for Barack Obama. He's walked that back. Who knows what the truth is? So, you know, definitely there are readers there who might, you know, view the actions of these officers as a good thing. You know, when I've mentioned the older books, I got to warn people about, you know, racism in the books. Well, there's certainly that in the Ellroy books too. I do not think Ellroy himself is in favor of racism. I don't think he's presenting that as a good thing. He's presenting it as, you know, as a fact of the era in question. But, you know, if that's going to bother you, okay, consider that a content warning. L.A. Confidential, the movie, is a masterwork of adaptation. Because, like I said, we're talking about, it's easily like a 500-page plus book that, and a lot of stuff had to get jettisoned. But as an act of compression, it still works. I mean, it still hits a lot of the novel's high points. I cannot recommend that highly enough. It was one of the, it was actually the very first DVD I ever bought when I got a DVD player. And I definitely saw it in the theater and loved it then. You know, he hasn't had a heck of a lot of luck with adaptations. Otherwise, you know, there's always talk. Like I said, White Jazz was an aborted project. There's been talk of doing American Tabloid on HBO. That hasn't worked. There was, you know, he's done some original scripting. He wrote Dark Blue that had Kurt Russell in it. But, you know, for example, Black Dahlia the movie did not work pretty well. You know, I didn't particularly care for Black Dahlia the book. I didn't find the characters particularly interesting. Although he does, in the first L.A. Quartet, present one of the great villains of modern crime literature, and that's a corrupt cop named Dudley Smith. And why I brought up Clandestine a few minutes ago is Clandestine, his second novel, is where Dudley pops up, and then he just sort of keeps Dudley on ice for years to bring him back in the Big Nowhere. And basically, Big Nowhere and L.A. Confidential and White Jazz also function as an arc of the life and eventual, well, how do I give this away without spoiling it? The eventual end, though not death, of Dudley Smith. Now, his latest novel, Perfidia, which is going to start off a second L.A. Quartet, functions as something of an origin story for Dudley Smith. We know that Dudley was born in Ireland, came to the U.S. We don't really have much else in the way of info about his early life. Well, in Perfidia, you get it. You also get his bizarre infatuation and tempestuous affair with Betty Davis, of all people. And so Perfidia is kind of interesting. It's sort of playing the old hits. It's kind of him going back, and again, with Ellroy, you never know. Is it a cynical attempt to recapture the interest in the earlier books, in the first L.A. Quartet? Because the Claire DeHaven, who's a character in the Big Nowhere, also appears in Perfidia, for example. There's a lot of people getting recycled, old characters, because Perfidia takes place in right before. It takes mostly in 1940, right before America's involvement in World War II. So here's the recommendation. The early books are good. I would say Clandestine is good. Brown's Requiem is good. There is a trio of books that are set in 1980s LA about a homicide detective named Lloyd Hopkins. If you like pulp, get those because they are pitched at a very high level of intensity, and a certain amount of implausibility, especially given talking about Hopkins's personal background, which I won't go into. So they're pretty purple. If you like that stuff, jump on those. Extremely violent. Ellroy's work in general is very violent and bloody. But there was a serial killer novel called Killer on the Road. I haven't read that in a long time. I remember liking it when I did. First LA Quartet, American Tabloid. I think you could stop with Underworld USA there, unless if you want to go on. I cannot strongly recommend doing so. I think there's a sharp decline there. Perfidia is better than probably it has any right to be. But if you like the first LA Quartet, definitely get into Perfidia. If you're interested in what happens before, go for that. So I got reservations about a fair number of these, but there are some other ones, man, that I cannot recommend highly enough. So that's Ellroy for this week. Production schedule may continue to be somewhat erratic. The weather's starting to settle down here. I'll be taping outside more. Got to learn how to use an editing program that I need to move into. So we'll start seeing some more cuts, more varieties of shots. Maybe someday even have a title sequence. Who knows? But as always, please like the YouTube page. Please follow Xenobooks on social media. Please, if you like the YouTube page, sign up for notifications. As always, sales links down in the description. Always click that, read more, and we'll take you right to Amazon. Get you some good stuff. Thank you, as always, for watching this. We'll talk to you next week. And that's that. James Ellroy. Go for it. Get some. Good night.